organizers for having me. It's really a pleasure to join this very distinguished group of speakers. So I think it's a different, I'm changing gear for the conference. I won't have any theorems, and I hope still as interesting to this crowd. Oops, if I can move it. So the goal of our work is really try to tackle this pretty difficult problem of interpreting machine learning, or particularly interpret deep learning. And one of the strong motivations, at least in Europe, is actually this EU General Data Protection Regulation gives the right for the users, say a patient, to explanation. So more and more AI is coming to precision medicine, and people like us, everyone will be affected by some sort of algorithmic, at least clinical aid. So this regulation gives right for the patient to ask why you making this recommendation. If you're relying on algorithm, how did the algorithm give the recommendation? And this is just a few examples where interpretation is needed, right? I met actually IPAM a couple of years ago, startup, CEO want to approve some deep learning based radiology like diagnosis, and FDA wants her to give some interpretation for the algorithm. And we work with Drosophila biologists, and we want to understand what genes drive a particular enhancer, which is really start the gene interaction. And we're working with cosmologists, you'll see later, and in general, say, sentiment analysis from Yelp, right? Why this sentence automatically is a positive sentiment sentence instead of a negative one. And a lot of my group's work is actually I'll call scientific machine learning. So the term has been used. Let me try to define what I mean. It's really try to use machine learning for scientific research, for discovery, theory, and knowledge, and try to build in scientific principles, but also try to use data to develop new science. So it's really interpretation of both. And I think scientific machine learning should hold a higher standard than just any machine learning. The paper 2019, a group of us from my students come together, really try to struggle with what do we mean by interpret machine learning, because we have genomics, neuroscience, and sentiment analysis, and we work on different interpretations, and can we come together and define it? So what we came up with is really try to emphasize the audience and what the problem is interpretations relative to, and discover some reality checked interpretation instead of, you can interpret things which have no reality. In one graph, we call PDR, predictive accuracy, which is taken from machine learning or statistics. It's really say there's reality check there, but also at the descriptive level, we also want some reality check. When you have interpretation for certain genes driving a particular biological phenomenon, there's domain knowledge to see this interpretation actually makes sense. But you want the description to be capturing what the algorithm is doing than just imagined particular audience. For an algorithm to be explained to me is very different to a layman, another patient, right? So its audience has to come in for interpretation. And as already said, this PDR. And usually in machine learning, people tend to think roughly like there's a trade-off between predictive accuracy and descriptive accuracy. It's like, well, decision trees is simple, logistic regression may be okay, but actually for this, you need only, you cannot interpret decision tree with steps 5. 3 maybe, logistic regression with 100 terms is just equally non-understandable because you don't remember all 100 terms. But this is roughly people agree that deep learning is probably the highest in terms of accuracy, but also the hardest to describe or interpret. But you will see my 2 examples through distillation of deep learning, we actually don't have this trade-off. We actually increase both interpretation accuracy and predictive accuracy. So this, it just roughly can happen, but it's not always a trade-off. Something can do both. Interpretation can help. The generic model-based interpretability people like to seek are sparsity. And the important thing is simulatability. It's like decision tree has the easiest, right? You can kind of follow, say, oh, that's why this decision made. And deep learning is not penetrable if you want to simulate human mind very quickly. And modularity is like decomposability. Things can be taken into simpler parts. Oh, domain knowledge, right? Credit scores. We feel like we understand. There are probably some data there. We know like 700 is good, but it's already become our knowledge. even though in the beginning, we don't exactly know how they take all our characteristics and made it into a credit score. But more and more things will be like that. We'll start taking this new score and start feeling that we have a sense of it. Post hoc interpretability is really already fitted the model, and you want to see which features are important. There are many ways to do that. And I want to emphasize what we try to do is really you not just give individual features, you can look at group of features for interaction. That's one thing my group has been really pushing. And also you look at individual level, not just the whole data set, this gene is important for a population of people, but for this person, what are the important factors? But one thing is, how do we know we trust some interpretable machine learning? Where does trust come from? And my group again developed this PCS framework for truthful data science process. It's really you try to vet every step of the way before you come up with the model, before you interpret. Without the very much vetted, controlled, quality controlled process, I don't think I have a lot of trust in the model you fit. And relevant science, it's also very important. We can get a domain scientist to really provide confirming scientific knowledge to the interpretation and build on the accumulation of factual, reliable, empirical evidence existing in the field. So now I'm going to expand with these more philosophical points into two concrete projects. The first is really a more generic, I'll say, important score development for individual features and also interactions of features for a fitted deep learning model. So this is taking a model already fit, you have good prediction accuracy. Now you want to take a peek inside. And then how do we visualize this interaction features so that it's easier for human mind? The previous work on post hoc interpretation have kind of more roughly fall into two categories. One is like gradient based, Lime and G. The other one is more occlusion or contribution, but you take something out and see what happens. So the salient map and sharp belong to this category. So what we developed belong to the second category. So this is the first actually case we try to look at for our own important score development for deep learning. So take a look from, say, LSTM, sentiment analysis, right? The movie was good, right? And we know it's positive, and we want to give some explanation. But the not good is not in not in good. You need to have a score for not good together. So we really want to give a score to not good, not just not and good. What we develop is really Jamie Murdoch, my former student, now in industry startup, developed this when he was an intern at Google, his mentor, Leo, and later myself. So the idea is really decompose the output from deep learning into two additive bits, one related to the thing you care about and the rest. And you do this additive decomposition for every layer and have a smart way of collecting and also distribute different bias for different terms, and you give the scores. So this is just what we did, so you have to validate it, right? We can decompose things in many different ways. Why this makes sense? Of course, when we think about it, we're putting a lot of understand deep learning into the decomposition, but eventually you have to evaluate it. And you basically take the original output into relevant bit and the irrelevant bit and run this through the layers and layers process, and we have a way to collect and propagate. It's a forward propagation of the scores, and then we end up with the final score. And you can do the later with generalize for convolution networks and general deep learning. In the beginning, it was only LSTM. Similarly, so example here. And after we have the scores, we feel like it's still not organized enough. The second paper, Chandan Singh, my current CS student, joined and really pushing this forward for the next stage. So you have this prediction. So now we're going to give scores. Our CD method give you scores for not, very, and good, right? This is the color means how positive, negative they are. The blue is positive and the orange is more negative. And then we combine two words to find the biggest jump of the score, because we also have score for very good. So it's kind of hierarchical clustering. And then we see, oh, the flip happened at the not very good. Everything's very positive until the last bit. So you can identify what's the important feature to turn the label negative. This is a more complex example where you can see underline the color shading. It's about each individual has a score. And then any phrases also have a score under our CD methodology. And you do hierarchical clustering, and you also can identify when the thing became negative and positive. So you really have now understanding how the algorithm is doing the labeling of sentiment analysis, positive and negative. This is a generalization to images, right? So you want to predict puck, and then we shaded. That's where we didn't do all the steps because many pixels, we jumped, and you can see the algorithm really start telling you for this image, the skates are very important, and also puck. And later you can remove the puck and see that actually skates are just important because they tend to appear together. It's association analysis, they are the causal analysis. We also carried out human experiments to compare with other methods, right? The one is remember we had two categories. One is gradient-based integrated IG, and the other occlusion existed before our kind of occlusion method. And we have the CD scores without the organization. And we asked humans, we have about 10 or 12 graduate students, and did the experiment that we're giving them interpretations from the different methods. And we hope they can tell from the interpretation which one the prediction has more accuracy for individual examples. And for the SST, it's a Stanford sentiment trunk. That's a sentiment analysis data base. Both our methods really stand up, but it's kind of small data set. MNIST, everybody does pretty well. It's a relatively simple data set, but the power of ACD, the visual hierarchical presentation of the CD score, really showed up in the ImageNet, right? You can see that it really, there's a very significant jump of people just find that very useful for them to predict which prediction is more accurate. And then we had another experiment showing that based on the examples, based on the interpretations, can you trust the model? And you can see that ACD also give good trust scores based on people reactions of the subjects. And the question I kept asking my students, and now I have this interpretation, you have to go back and really improve things. So this paper led by a visiting student, Laura from Denmark, was ICML, really did that. I'll just say very quickly, is that we basically use the interpretation in the fitting and saying that suppose you want to decrease the reliance of your prediction, say on gender, you want to be more gender unbiased, then you just force it through the explanation penalty. And you say that I want the score to be close to 0. And this way you're pushing the fit to be something not relying on gender very much. We can then improve really the decrease the reliance on unfavorable traits. So here's really scientific. Before I was really preparing ourselves, we really started from more generic problems, and now we want to connect to scientific reality. So we start out to work with postdoc from, this is really the result of NSF tripods grant we got. And Francois was a cosmology, also postdoc, and Wusuk, the one on the top left, was also postdoc. So I said, well, let's work together and use this interpretation method already, and Chandon joined, and 2 colleagues of Francois also joined from Berkeley Cosmology Center. So this is really try to put our interpretation to test. Does it really help science? So Francois and colleagues simulated the universe, a very important universe, which is the mass density of the origin of the universe called omega m. So they use PDEs, I think a lot of people probably know about the PDE generated than I do, today. And we observe this is all simulated, but eventually we use this as like an incubator. So later we can understand the universe by knowing what's going on and see whether the method is reliable. So we have the observed simulated map of a mass in the universe. And when you have this simulation result, and Francois already used deep learning and get the best retrieval of the omega m. And they simulate something called the 10 cosmologies. That means they actually have different 10 sets of parameters, not just omega m, there are also other parameters, a couple other parameters they use, and they simulate different sets of them and forward simulation. And for each of them, they also have many, many images. And deep learning really turned out to be the best method. I'll mention some of the early methods. Oops. How do we, one thing they've asked us is like, can we understand how this deep learning does the estimation? And maybe we can reduce, it's very costly to simulate this big universe. And can we reduce the computation through the understanding? Because if there's certain part of the simulation really, it doesn't really help you to estimate omega m, maybe we can do a coarser simulation. So first thing to do when you really have like off-the-shelf method, every time you solve a real problem, the first thing is actually it's not exactly fit, but you can revise your tool to solve the problem. So one thing they told us that the interpretability really lies in the Fourier space. Is that when you go to the simulation also to do with the Fourier space, and they want to interpret the contributions of these different frequencies like 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, and they want to have a score for this frequency bands. So we generalize our method to go to the transform space because it's an invertible transform, and then we can come up with scores for this whole frequency bands. And this is the score for these different bands. And you can see that the highest score is at around 0.3. So that's a frequency band. So this is indication. And then beyond 0.8 or something, the deep learning, which does very good prediction, doesn't really rely on. So this is a cue that for them to say, maybe we don't have to simulate that those frequency bands with such a precision. Of course, this is only suggestive. So they could do is they could really remove that and see whether the result change, right? This is still association analysis, but with the simulation setup, they can now reduce computation in the high frequency band and see whether the result of estimate omega m would degrade. And then since we're Fourier, I worked on a wavelets image processing like 20, 30 years ago. And I said, well, if you do Fourier, we should do wavelets. It's a more flexible decomposition with both frequency. It's not, it's a local Fourier transform. So let's go wavelets. And actually independently, Francois was also making the same suggestions. So it was great that we really aligned with what we want to do next step. So, so here, before I go to wavelets, I want to talk about how does this compare with, this is a very simplistic simulation model to compare with other interpretation methods. And we generated model with a ground truth frequencies. And we see whether our CD score really give high weights to the identity, to the true frequencies. And you can see that we do quite a bit better than the comparative methods like deep lift, SHAP, and also IG. Right? This is a very clean signal, but we almost get 100%, and they have quite a few percent off. This is just a sanity check to see that we actually in a situation we know what's going on, then we do identify the important frequencies. So as I mentioned earlier, right, relevancy is the key, right? You want insight, which we did provide some to the cosmology problem, and had to be validated and correspond well with what people know in cosmology. And that's all, it's also the reality check. There's another very interesting line of work that started from deep learning, Hinton and collaborators. It's people have been really saying, complaining that deep learning is too big, right? Some of the big, have millions of parameters. It's impenetrable black box. And there's very interesting work started by Hinton. Well, actually started by another person, Rich Karuna. I should have mentioned that too, from Microsoft. And this Hinton paper really made it much more well-known, called model distillation. So the idea is that we have this pretty much black box model, pretty complex, but because the largeness of the deep learning, we know that has a lot of advantage in terms of computation flexibility and efficiency and approximation properties, that can we, after we fit this complex model, can we distill into a simpler neural network model? That's the first work what we're doing. It's really, we start with this big complex model, but we find a smaller one. Other people have pushed the boundary to any interval model, not just a small neural network, but say decision trees or editing models, right? So this doesn't have to be, you can start deep learning network, you don't have to stay with neural networks, you can go somewhere else. And as I mentioned, a decision trees is often doctors make decisions. We have another work we did with ER doctors at UCSF. It's really vetting, use the PCS framework, their decision rules for sending a kid in the ER department to CT scan or not. So this is very desirable decision trees. It's better with human interactions. So we set out to do is that we want to do it through wavelets, because we think in physical sciences and biological sciences, it's really a very nice modern version for your analysis with a lot of physical connections. And we want to distill a deep learning model through wavelets. And we want to improve interpretability and compression and efficiency, right? If you have very simple models, you can do easier to store and easier to do a new computation of prediction. So this is very much driven by cosmology, right? Fourier transform, and wavelet just seems a natural next step. I think for this audience, probably I don't have to give for usually machine learning and the statistics people, well, statistics people probably know some of it too, but for machine learning people, wavelets is probably still pretty foreign, except for a few people like Stefan Malad and Joan Bruno. So this is really a different tiling of the frequency and the time domain, right? Time series is tiling it for each time, and frequency, Fourier transform is tiling the second picture, and wavelet transform is tiling both together. And Malad and Mayer, there are a lot of good standard reference books for orthogonal wavelets transform. So that's our idea. We want to learn wavelets from data. And what we do is that we first do, suppose you're giving a wavelet transform phi. And then you do forward transform. And then you also have a corresponding orthogonal with inverse. And then you put the whole thing, and then you have f hat, x hat. And that's the one fed into the pre-trained neural network. You can see that it's really the same thing, because the wavelet transform inverse cancel, but for optimization for our method, we need to do the decomposition. So the f is all the things in the orange box. And then we design this loss function. Now you can see why my question about strong form came from in earlier talk. The first is really say you want the reconstruction loss to be controlled. And then the second loss are called wavelet loss. You want to make sure what you learn, its coefficients really satisfy all this defining equation for wavelets, that they actually form more wavelets. And the last part is by interpretation loss. you want in the F, the trim as a transform, things are very interpretable in the wavelet domain. So let me just expand and give you the details of the three terms. The first term is pretty obvious. I don't have to explain. It's the wavelet loss function. So this is just lifted out from a large, we're finding these defining properties of wavelets, right? This is kind of the filter bank presentation. And we take all these equations, orthogonal wavelet transform, giving a mother wavelet, phi, needs to be satisfied. And we just turn them into penalties, as in the strong form of our earlier talk when you solve differential equation. And these two equations are not exactly defining because there's 7.31 we kind of didn't worry about because it's kind of hard to turn into like a penalty. But more or less, we are trying to make these defining properties of orthogonal wavelet transform into penalties so we can force through the wavelet loss function. And we also added something about the G function in the wavelet decomposition. So again, you have two equations and you turn it into one penalty because G hat 0 has to be 0. So you want that the sum to be small. So that's why you can reckon, but we did add one more term, which is the sparsity wavelet coefficients. And then all the other big terms are really copying from the defining properties of wavelets and make them into penalties, very much like in the strong form solution approach to partial differential equation. And the third term is the interpretation loss, which is building on, remember our work from CD, but we didn't use CD, actually. We use a trim, which is, we use basically the derivative, normal derivative as the loss function, as the penalty. It's just easier to calculate. And this is just saying that you put it in the big F as a function, and you take the derivative of F, and with all of that, you can take advantage of the PyTorch, all that have very good differentiation functions, and then you can calculate it very easily. So put it together, we have three terms: reconstruction term, wavelet term to enforce wavelet, and the interpretation term. So this is just like a synthetic simulation to show that we actually recover the ground truth wavelet. So we have a synthetic input, it's kind of noise version of wavelets, and we fit fully connected neural network, and we distill the wavelet as I described by minimizing that three-term loss function, and we compare with ground truth. So initialization is one of the challenging problems for deep learning, at least before the recent wave, right? Jan LeCun's group always did, even in the 90s, one of Bell Labs. And they were still working on, a neural network, not many people working on it. And the folklore was that, Jan's group can really tune to make neural net work, but initialization otherwise can be difficult. Now we have more standard way to do it for deep learning. But for this, we also have an initialization problem. So we start with a wavelet, COIF2 and SIM5, you all end up with something similar. And we also start with a wavelet and then did a random noise to it and still converge the right thing. So if you start with a complete random uniform noise, you do have to put, so what we did now, I don't have the result, but we're running it now, is that you start completely random, you need to force it to be a little bit like wavelets or smooth. So what we do is that we actually just forget about interpretation term, just enforce the wavelet term to get something pretty close in something remotely like wavelet. And then we add the interpretation term. Interpretation term doesn't make sense before you get something close to wavelet. So that will make it work. But you cannot run just we can hit instability if we just don't first force it a bit like a wavelet neighborhood. And So this is just a ground truth that from different initializations, you get something. You can see Sim5 gets something now that's close to the truth, but still pretty much on the line. So now back to the cosmology problem. It turns out after I made a suggestion about wavelets, and Francois also made the same suggestion, and he actually pointed out to that people already used wavelets to do a cosmology. So what we did here is we use ResNet to do the estimation, and we use our method AWD to distill the wavelet. That's what you see, the 4 blocks. You have low frequency, low high, high low, and then high high. And for each of the peak, you basically use the wavelet moving around and get the peak counting, and then you see the 4 peaks. The first one is actually has pretty low, you don't see a peak, so only see 3 peaks for the high frequency, because the signals in this cosmology image is really the peaks, not the low frequency bits, because that's where the mass density matters. So what we did that instead of using a fixed wavelet, so this already in cosmology, people already use a fixed wavelet to do the last part. So what we did is AWD, the first number on the left, is use ResNet and distill the wavelets, as I showed you, and then use the old peak method people use for fixed wavelets. And you can see that this is a prediction error, and we have the lowest prediction error, and we reduce the loss from ResNet by 15%. So that's significant. And we basically obtain both interpretability and improve the predictability. Remember my trade-off in the beginning, I said it's not always the case. You have to trade off interpretability with prediction. I think this just says that, to me, the deep learning still doesn't have enough regularity. And that's why we can still gain by having more regularity through forcing and wavelet transform. And we actually got both improved prediction performance and got interpretation out. And you see that if we don't put the last number, if we don't use the interpretation loss, just false wavelets, we have basically only adaptive wavelet, but not distilled, not taking care of the interpretation from deep learning network, then you still do better than DB5 wavelet. That's the third one from the right. Right, we get 1.3 instead of 1.5. So that's fixed wavelets and using the peak counting method. And if you use other methods, there's some Laplacian, you have different varied performance. But ResNet beat everything. But if we take advantage of ResNet and add wavelets, we beat ResNet by 15%. So this was a Nature astronomy paper, I think, using the peak count. So how do you do the estimation in the peak counting methods? Actually, you get the peaks and you form a multivariate Gaussian. And then because you have the simulation cosmology, the parameters, and you see which one is closer for new data. And then you just say, well, whatever the omega seem to be the closest in this kind of Mahabalus distance, and then that's the estimation method. So that's how you go from the peak counting kind of feature extraction back to omega m. And that's just people already use it for fixed wavelets. So we're just following the same method. So this gives you, we have 2 parameters on the wavelet loss and also on the interpretation loss, and they vary. You get different slightly different wavelets, but this is symmetric, right? You can see that we started with asymmetric and we end up with a symmetric. So there's quite a bit change. The first one you can see is asymmetric, and we both cut down the reconstruction loss and wavelet loss. That's at bottom. You see so there's a real trade-off with interpretation and wavelets. Okay, so now we have developed this method. My group also worked with bioimaging people to understand basic site biology, and we'll also use deep learning there for some more like data extracted from images, but it's like one-dimensional time series data. And I said, let's try that and see. Just going to see whether this methodology is really useful cross disciplines, not just from cosmology. Because statistics and machine learning is really, we try to solve many different problems, not just particular domain area. So this is a project I work with the ABC Advanced Bioimaging Center, Goko, who is the executive scientific director. We have been working for this problem before the interpretation problem for 2 or 3 years. So this is a really interesting problem, fundamental problem in cell biology. So in cell biology, it's very, very important to track, they call molecular bipartners, that you want to know how these molecules interact. They often trigger one to the other. So this on the left hand, this you call this one, I call the orange one, and it's the Clathrin. And on the right is called oxalin, which is more expensive to track. So we want to use the easily observed Clathrin to predict the oxalin, which is really tell you the completion of very important process called CME, which I'll tell you next time. Next slide. So this is the first image processing. Identify, because there's a lot of good models. It's blur imaging, it's microscopy. I think it's light sheet microscopy, and then you try to turn it into more like time series data. Yeah, so we want to really, predict from the orange to the green. And oops, what happened to? Sorry. Oh, I skipped. Somehow this got skipped. So I should say, what's this about? I should have done the other slide later. So this is really about this something very important in biology called the Clathrin-mediated endocytosis. This is a very basic cell functions, how the cell gets cargoes or food or whatever from outside the cell membranes to inside the cell, right? This is a very nice one I got from this paper, Nature Review 2018. You can see in the cargo, it's basically the cells outside needs to get in, and you get a coating and then initialization, and then you kind of fold it in and enclose it, and then the yellow little sticks gets inside. So the coronavirus also had to go through this process, and there's papers studying this CME for COVID virus, how they get into our cells. And we want to know whether this something called CME happened. And Clathrin is very, very important. That's the orange one I already showed you. And then the green one actually is oxalin, will tell you that in cargo gets inside the cell completed. So not everything initiated by Clathrin will get completed. So we want to use Clathrin to predict whether that cargo actually got transported inside the cell. I thought there was something missing. Okay, so that's the background, very important basic cellular process. And through those video images, we already followed these bright spots and turned it into a time series. We tried to go back to the video and use deep learning, because deep learning for video hasn't really worked very well except for framing, so it didn't really help. So we just start using deep learning at the second stage after pre-processing, using Gaussian deconvolution to as a time series model. And then we distilled the LSTM works the best in terms of prediction of labels. And we distilled, now this is a symmetric wavelet. This time it's R-score, so one is bigger. Before it's a prediction error, this is really try to see correlation with the proportional variance explained. So we want it to be bigger. You can see that DB5 get 0.19. LSTM really did a lot better, got 0.23. If you don't use the interpretation loss, it's still pretty good. It's not as good as LSTM, but know that if we combine the two together, the wavelet constraint and also interpretation based on LSTM, you really have a 0.03 jump. So that's quite substantial. So it's really both the power of wavelets and also the learning power of LSTM. Okay, so I think I probably have quite a lot of time for questions. So the first part, we try to lay out the framework for defining interpret machine learning. Because we talk about interpretation, but it's like everything means different things. And so we define through the predictive accuracy, descriptive accuracy, and relevance. So basically answer the question for what and for whom, and with reality checks through a predictive accuracy. And for what means descriptive, what you try to describe. And for whom means relevance. And then I introduced the CD, contextual decomposition, or the combined version, ACD, for a trained deep learning for features and group of features. And then the most scientific bit is really the AWD, right? We have this three-term optimization, reconstruction, wavelet loss, and also the interpretation loss for wavelet decomposition. And we showed successes, both improve the prediction and interpretation at the same time, because I think the wavelet constraint added the extra regularization that's needed. And deep learning didn't give enough regularization, at least not in the right way, for cosmology and biology problems. And we are finishing a review paper, have actually all of the three projects in one. There's a book edited on explainer AI, so that should be coming soon. I'll put it on my website probably next week. So you can watch out for kind of a written version of the talk. So looking forward, we're very excited about the success of the wavelets, and we hope to get more scientific insights from this distilled wavelets for the cellular biology problem, and also for cosmology. And we're also working on expanding the one layer wavelet transform to multi-layers, right? Scattering transforms already multi-layer. And we think we can make some contribution there. So my idea is that we'll replace all the layers of 100, whatever, 80 layers to something much fewer, and also much fewer coefficients for each layer through the wavelet. Because you see, with mother wavelet, right, you define the mother wavelet, all the dilation and scaling just automatically done for you. So you only need to define the mother wavelet. The goal, I hope, is that for each layer, we can also reduce the number of layers, right? For ResNet, remember for cosmology, how many layers? Then we end up with one layer of wavelets. And with the peak method, we do better. And we also think for other problem, probably won't be one layer is enough. So can we build out multiple layers, but hope still reduce the layers, and for each layer, only using one learned mother wavelet to summarize what's going on for each layer. And I was having some exchange with Haizhao that the most exciting for me also is really try to derive new PDEs, right? I know I'm speaking in front of all the PDE experts, but I hope to get help from you guys. It's really deriving new PDEs through wavelets. Right now we can learn data-driven wavelets already. Can we go back? And it's like, I know the solution of PDE now. Can I now, so for example, you guys can use deep learning and use our method to work with us to get wavelets. Would that tell us something about how do we revive some of the standard PDEs? And on that, I want to have a shout out for our new book to be on data science for people, especially not trained in statistics machine learning, to connect reality with symbols, and should be available. We're going to have a free online indirect copy by fall. And it's really intended to lower the barrier for people who want to get started on data science through this PCS framework. And we spent a lot of time on the whole data science lifecycle, and also try to teach critical thinking. How do you turn a domain problem and connect with symbols? What does X mean for your problem? If you don't have that connection, the mathematics won't have the relevance and the impact in the real world. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very nice talk. If you have any question, please feel free to raise your hand or unmute yourself.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Yeah, I want to know more about this your model distillation. Does it only been used so far for images, or has it been used for 1D problems?
Yes. So the molecular biology project, you're right that the data came from video, but we already distilled into a time series, and the LSTM is used on time series data. And then we distill the wavelet using the 1D data.
Yeah, but I want to know more about, because I've never used this before. How do you actually select, because you're using wavelet to select from a complex model to a simpler model? What about a problem that is no longer on images, no longer a 2D problem? That means when you cannot use wavelet to solve the problems, for example, shape boundaries problems.
I think you have to have a natural, for the whatever problem, you need to have a natural presentation of some generalization wavelets already. That has to be there. Right. So for time series, we already did it. For images, we already did it. For your problem, if you can have some wavelet presentation without deep learning, at least get some goal at that, then I think you can apply our approach.
Sure. Maybe I should spend more time.
Yeah, you should probably follow up. Send me an email and we can.
Yeah, I will. Maybe I should read more about this model distillation first. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it's pretty new. We submitted to NERS. We're in the rebuttal stage now, but sure. We're quite excited about this, especially the improved performance.
Sure, I will. I can find your email on your website, right? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I got it from this page, from this here. All right, sure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any more questions? Can I ask? Andrea, please go ahead. No?
Okay. No, I was just saying hello.
Hi, Andrea. I know you're coming.
Okay. Can I ask a very simple question? So from the framework, we can see that you add some penalization to penalize interpretation. In general, how can we design the loss function for interpretation? Is it problem dependent?
Well, you have many choices. We took the derivative, right? So you could try other ones, right? We took this as the interpretation. It's for simplicity, and it worked pretty well. So, I mean, we built down the gradient has been used for interpreting deep learning by many people. So we just took one version of it. We didn't even use our own ACD, which is more complex. So, because we want the optimization to go more smoothly using what's available. And as I showed you, right, we did for this, if you remove the last number, if you use AWD without the interpretation loss, you don't do as well as if you do use the gradient version of interpretation loss. But that, just like penalties, I think you have to find try and error for the domain problem. I think it's good we have many different choices, but it shouldn't be one size fit all, right? So just try different things, but computation feasibility plays a role on which one do you use. And for this one, because the gradient is easy to carry in PyTorch, we just do the gradient. We didn't even use our own more complex importance score. And I think for physical sciences and even biological sciences, imaging, I think there's a lot of potential for these adaptive wavelets and take advantage of the power of deep learning for predictive accuracy. Basic computation apparatus, you can search much bigger space in an efficient way.
Thanks.
And then you kind of summarize in wavelets, which we all have, warm and fuzzy feeling about, especially for this community. It's also very useful. I have this physical, like for local Fourier transform interpretation.
Thanks. So maybe the simplest case you use is to minimize the norm of the change, so that the change in the function will not be too large as an interpretation.
Yeah, the interpretation usually like you want things to have big change. That's important,
Thanks.
right? And then that's kind of the idea. Something is problem, but you change, you see a big effect, and you can use difference instead of gradient. So that's all different versions of it.
Yes.
So going back to the earlier talk of Professor Liu, I can see that he already had a deep learning solver, and then he can also do this and get a wavelet presentation of his deep learning solution.
Thanks. And thanks a lot again for the nice talk. Maybe it's time for the next speaker. Could you stop sharing? And
Yes.
Professor Andrew Montanari, could you try to share your screen?